Security footage from the Meridian Heights leasing office lobby, later obtained during an internal review, shows the following exchange. Property management CEO Garrett Bloom stands near the leasing counter, flanked by two regional managers, mid-tour with a group of prospective corporate investors. A mail carrier in a gray-blue uniform, cart parked by the entrance, is sorting packages into resident boxes. "This is actually a great example," Bloom says, gesturing toward the mail carrier without lowering his voice. "We've been trying to get the postal contract switched to a private courier for months. Cuts costs, modernizes the resident experience. No offense, Walter, but this whole setup is a relic." The mail carrier, Walter Ochoa, doesn't look up from the packages. Effective end of month, Bloom continues, turning back to the investors. Meridian Heights will be one of the first properties in our portfolio to go fully digital delivery. No more carts in the lobby. One investor chuckles. Walter sets the package and his hand down gently on the counter. But none of them knew who he really was. 7 months earlier, Walter Ochoa was 59 years old, and for 16 years he had walked Route 14, covering Meridian Heights and the surrounding blocks, memorizing which resident was expecting a package for a birthday, which elderly tenant needed her mail handed to her directly instead of left in the box, which building's lobby door stuck in cold weather and needed an extra shove. He wore the same gray-blue uniform every day, kept a small tin of butterscotch candies in his mail cart for the kids waiting at the bus stop, and always finished his route by 2 p.m., leaving his afternoons free for the modest woodworking shop he kept in his garage. Every autumn, he built a wooden nativity set piece by piece, one new figure each year, a tradition he'd started the year his wife, Denise, passed away, something steady to build while everything else felt unsteady. What almost no one on Route 14 knew was that Walter Ochoa had once been a successful commercial real estate developer, the very person who had built Meridian Heights Apartments from an empty lot 30 years earlier. He'd developed the property with his brother-in-law, intending it as a legacy project, affordable, well-built housing in a neighborhood that needed it. After Denise's death, grief made the business feel hollow. Walter sold his development company but quietly retained something few people knew about, a small, permanent ground lease interest in the Meridian Heights property itself, structured decades earlier as a tax and estate planning tool, entitling him to lifetime access to the grounds and a modest but real say in any major changes to the property's operations. He never used that leverage. He simply took the postal exam a year later, wanting quiet, steady work that let him be near people without needing to manage anything. Walking Route 14, past the building he'd built with his own hands, became its own kind of peace. He never told anyone at Meridian Heights who he used to be. Grief, for Walter, was something best carried alone, in a uniform nobody looked at twice. When Garrett Bloom's company acquired the regional portfolio that included Meridian Heights, he saw Walter as an easy symbol of old infrastructure, holding back his modernization pitch to investors. He instructed the leasing office to stop holding packages for elderly residents at the front desk, a small courtesy Walter had always relied on to help them, calling it not our department's responsibility. He publicly joked about Walter's mail cart blocking aesthetic sightlines during a property walkthrough with corporate visitors, loud enough for Walter to hear from across the lobby. He had the leasing office quietly restrict Walter's access to the building's side entrance, the one that let him avoid a long walk around in bad weather, citing updated security protocols. Without ever speaking to Walter directly, Walter said nothing each time. He simply nodded, adjusted his cart, and kept sorting the mail. The investor tour was Bloom's opportunity to prove his company's digital-first vision to a group of potential portfolio partners, and Walter's mail cart made for an easy visual punchline about legacy inefficiency. So he mocked Walter publicly in the lobby, in front of investors, in front of residents passing through, announcing the end of in-person mail delivery at the property as though it were entirely his decision to make. "No more carts in the lobby," Bloom repeated, smiling for the group. Walter looked toward Bloom for a long moment. Buried in decades-old property records, the title company's reviewer flagged an unusual clause, a permanent ground lease and access covenant attached to the original 1990s development agreement, still active, still binding, granting its holder lifetime access rights to the property and a formal consent requirement for any changes affecting building access or essential resident services. The covenant named one person,
Walter J. Ochoa.
What nobody at Meridian Heights realized was that Walter Ochoa wasn't simply a friendly, aging mail carrier with an old-fashioned cart. He was the property's original developer and still held a legally binding ground lease covenant requiring his consent for exactly the kind of access changes Bloom had just unilaterally made, restricting Walter's own side entrance access, no less, without realizing whose consent he legally needed in the first place. The refinancing deal, worth tens of millions, couldn't legally close with an unresolved covenant violation on the title. Walter hadn't invoked anything. He hadn't mentioned the covenant once in 30 years. He'd simply kept walking his route, unaware, or perhaps quietly unwilling to use, the leverage he'd held the entire time. The title company's attorney brought the discrepancy directly to Bloom's office, laying the original development agreement on the desk, the covenant holder's name typed clearly at the bottom. "Do you recognize this name?" she asked, sliding the document across. Bloom stared at it.
Walter J. Ochoa.
Then, slowly, he thought of the mail carrier's uniform name tag he'd walked past 100 times without ever reading closely, W. Ochoa, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The office went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang unanswered. Bloom's assistant, standing in the doorway, didn't say a word. There was no lawsuit filed, no dramatic press conference. Just a formal notice from Walter's estate attorney, informing Bloom's company that the recent access restrictions constituted a covenant violation requiring immediate remedy before the refinancing could proceed, and requesting a full accounting of any policy changes made without the required consent. The company's ownership group acted fast, unwilling to risk a stalled refinancing over an avoidable oversight. Bloom was placed on administrative leave within the week pending an internal governance review. The company's regional president personally visited Walter on his mail route, apologizing at length and asking him, humbly, sincerely, if he would consider formally exercising his advisory rights under the covenant, joining the property's ownership group as a permanent consulting partner on tenant services decisions. Walter thought about it for several days, sorting mail as he always had in the meantime. Then he agreed, on one condition. In-person mail delivery and package holding for elderly residents would be permanently restored, the side entrance reopened, and a formal accessibility review conducted for every tenant who'd been affected by the digital locker rollout. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Walter stood in his garage workshop, sanding the newest figure for that year's nativity set, a small wooden mail carrier, cart and all, a detail he'd never added before. His daughter, visiting for the weekend, watched him work. "You could have told them who you were the whole time," she said, turning the little figure over in her hands. "Didn't seem important," Walter said. What mattered was walking that route every day, same as always. That never changed, whether anyone knew who built the place or not. The following Monday, Walter walked Route 14 exactly as he always had, mail cart and all, stopping first at Meridian Heights, where the side entrance stood propped open again, and an elderly resident waited by the door, smiling, expecting her package the way she always had. Some people mistake a mail cart for a small life, and a quiet uniform for an empty history. But the strongest people rarely need to announce what they've built. They simply keep showing up, keep their patience, and let the truth surface only when it's needed to protect what actually matters. Walter Ochoa never raised his voice, never once said the word developer, never demanded his name on a plaque. He only ever asked that the people on his route be treated with care. And when the truth of who he was finally surfaced, it didn't arrive to punish anyone. It simply made sure the building he built would never forget who it was built for. If this story reminded you that the quietest people often carry the deepest histories, subscribe to Hidden Truth Chronicles and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next story.